Yes, we would be live in a minute. Yes,
Another
I think
minute.
we're live now.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, let me welcome you all to our Wednesday seminar. We have with us today a panel of very distinguished speakers who will be sharing their views on the topic China's position on Afghanistan. We have Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, who is currently Senior Visiting Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. He has also served as India's ambassador to Afghanistan, where he reopened the Indian embassy in Kabul as chargé d'affaires after the ouster of the Taliban in November 2001. Dr. Andrew Small, Senior Transatlantic Fellow with the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and an Associate Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Ms. Suhasini Haidar, Diplomatic Editor of The Hindu. We are also joined by Mr. Peter Rimelli, Resident Representative to India, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, to give brief introductory remarks. And finally, chairing the discussion is Ambassador Ashok Kantha, Director of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Before I invite the chair to begin the proceedings, let me lay out the housekeeping rules. All participants except the speakers will be muted for the duration of the event. Participants are requested to send in their queries via the chat box or use the raise hand option. Please unmute yourself only when called upon to do so by the chair. I will now invite the chair to begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Rija. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. Let me also welcome all of you to this edition of the ICS Wednesday seminar on the theme China's position in Afghanistan. As Rija mentioned, the Institute of Chinese Studies is hosting this panel discussion in collaboration with the India office of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, a print and media partner for the event. Friends, if you look at the theme of today's conversation, we'll be discussing various issues relating to China's position on Afghanistan. The first point I would like to make here in brief is that China today is in a position of considerable advantage in Afghanistan after Taliban takeover of the country. Indeed, it was well prepared for this scenario, which has emerged in recent weeks in Afghanistan. It had maintained contacts with Taliban for the last several years, even while pursuing close relations with the former Afghan government. Its actions have given legitimacy to Taliban. In this context, I would like to mention in particular a very high-profile meeting Foreign Minister Wang Yi had with Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar at Tianjin on 28th July. Since the takeover by the Taliban on 15th August and subsequent formation of interim government by Taliban, China has welcomed these developments. China has welcomed the interim government as a necessary step and an end to the anarchy in Afghanistan. It has been at pains to project that Taliban 2.0 is different from its earlier incarnation. Chinese Foreign Office spokesperson has described Taliban as more rational and also remarked that China respected the will of the Afghan people, implying thereby that the regime change in Afghanistan represented the popular will. At the same time, let me also point out that China has underlined the interim character of the new government formed by the Taliban and called for a more open and inclusive political structure in Kabul. Speaking at the SCO summit last week, President Xi Jinping remarked, "We need to encourage Afghanistan to put in place a broad-based and inclusive political framework, adopt prudent and moderate domestic and foreign policies, resolutely fight all forms of terrorism, live in amity with its neighbors." These comments by Xi, as also remarks made by Foreign Minister Wang Yi and of spokespersons of Chinese Foreign Office, would seem to suggest that China is not entirely satisfied with the structure and composition of the current Taliban dispensation in Kabul, and that it is pressing for a more inclusive and open regime to emerge out of the present discussions. The most important priority for China is to ensure that Afghanistan does not become a base for ETIM or other radical Islamic elements meddling in Xinjiang. It has received public assurances from Taliban in this context. China's expectations in this regard have repeatedly been articulated by Chinese leaders, and this will remain a major preoccupation for China. Looking ahead, one may expect China's footprints to expand in Afghanistan once the security situation improves and there is greater stability in the country. However, China will do so in a calibrated manner and not rush to fill the security and economic vacuum created by the withdrawal of US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. It will not be keen to bankroll the new dispensation in Kabul beyond a point. Foreign Minister Wang Yi has publicly stated that the USA must fulfill its obligations and take the primary responsibility for the reconstruction of Afghanistan. These remarks don't quite indicate that China is waiting with bated breath to utilize the vacuum which has emerged in Afghanistan post the US departure. Friends, China, as you are aware, has secured projects in Afghanistan, including Aina copper mine, but those projects have remained stalled. Chinese have so far been squatting on projects rather than being serious about their implementation. We may expect expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative projects in Afghanistan, but China will wait for the security situation to improve. Security of its personnel is a very important consideration with China. Taliban, of course, is keen on China providing large economic assistance to Afghanistan and getting fully involved in reconstruction of the country. But I suspect that China will proceed cautiously in this regard. At the same time, I believe that China will play a more proactive role in shaping the contours of the new regime in Afghanistan and its policies, working very closely with Pakistan in particular. It's unclear what kind of role China will play in moving towards political reconciliation and a more inclusive regime in Kabul that it has asked for. I believe that it's unlikely to get excessively entangled in intra-Afghan affairs. Afghanistan is likely to emerge as an even more important facet of the strategic nexus between China and Pakistan. Among other things, Pakistan and China have a shared interest in reducing and minimizing India's role and influence in Afghanistan. There are, however, differences in the approaches of China and Pakistan with regard to Afghanistan. China, as I mentioned earlier, has urged Taliban to pursue moderate, stable domestic and foreign policies, which is hardly a priority for Pakistan. However, one suspects that China and Pakistan will manage the differences in this regard, as they have done on a host of other issues in their relations. China is fully mindful of the larger geopolitical implications of the disorderly US retreat from Afghanistan. Chinese media has been at pains to project that the US withdrawal has severely undermined its credibility. Developments in Afghanistan will have an important bearing on the rapidly expanding Sino-US strategic rivalry. The Biden administration is projecting, as you're aware, that free of entanglements in Afghanistan, the US will be able to focus more on countering China in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. We'll have to see if that is indeed the case. Now, I just flagged some of the issues which may come up during conversation this afternoon. I'm sure other issues will also be taken up by three very fine experts we have today who will help us understand developments linked to China's position in Afghanistan. However, before we hear from Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, Dr. Andrew Small and Ms. Suhasini Haidar, I will invite my good friend and country head of the India office of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung to make the introductory remarks. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Ashwin. Dear Ms. Haidar, Mr. Mukhopadhyay, Dr. Small, Ambassador Kanta, distinguished guests, good afternoon. We all know how the Chinese government is acting with great harshness against Muslims in Xinjiang. However, we now see the Chinese endeavors to foster diplomatic relations with the radical Islamist regime of the Taliban. Furthermore, as Chinese journalists gloat over the failure of the United States in Afghanistan and call it the last storm before doom, A Chinese representative to the UN Security Council has appealed to the international community to provide much needed humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. So doomsday has not come yet. At first glance, these actions seem contradictory. However, the Chinese government, as we know it today, can be called a lot of things, but definitely unorganized or inconsistent is not one of them. One can always depend on the fact that China acts upon a strategy which is deeply thought out. To uncover the reasons and the strategy behind these actions will be one of the objectives of today's panel. What economic possibilities does China see in Afghanistan? What geostrategic space in Chinese thinking does Afghanistan fit in? It's a new member of the Geo-Economic Belt and Road Initiative or not? How realistic would that plan be? Does China maybe has an eye on the considerable mineral resources in Afghanistan? What challenges would China have to meet in realizing the potential of these mineral resources? But also, how can Afghanistan threaten Chinese interests, treat them too maybe? Is China concerned that the Taliban might support cross-border Islamist terrorism in China and the independence aspirations of the Uyghur minority in the Chinese province of Xinjiang? Are these concerns reasonable? A fact that cannot be underestimated is that while the United States failed to stabilize and secure Afghanistan, it is China that will be one of the key players, if not the one, when it comes to the future stability of Afghanistan and by extension to South Asia. Lastly, when discussing the Chinese perspective and challenges on and in Afghanistan, let us not forget what our ultimate goal must be: to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan and to deal with the threat of terrorism. However, we should never let the conflict of governing systems overshadow the commonalities. All of us find the situation in Afghanistan to be complex, evolving, and still very fluid. All of us are interested in improving regional security, and Afghanistan is the primary key, for now at least. All of us would profit from an economically and politically stabilized Afghanistan. Here there are two schools of thought, and the first one is of the opinion that the situation is still very volatile and will probably sort itself out the one way or the other without any interventions. The second school, of course, having the opposite thoughts, they advocate that we must not allow ourselves to be frozen in inaction in the face of the power shift in Afghanistan, following the withdrawal of the US troops, facing our humanitarian responsibility. We must be open to compromises and discussions. Now, having said that, the recent SARC meeting maybe should not have been called off. This, however, does not mean that we have to give up our values or lose our integrity in this increasingly polarized and complex world. Pragmatic solutions and compromises are necessary to move forward, not strict dogmas. To not act, we will let China and Russia take control of the situation. This will deepen the power shift that has already accrued. The bigger the power shift, the smaller our ability to positively influence the situation in Afghanistan. We must remember that withdrawing troops and shutting down embassies does not mean that problems in Afghanistan will disappear. And whether we like it or not, China is a big player in the complex Afghanistan situation and will be a key partner for us in dealing with this conflict. We have to understand what is at stake for China in Afghanistan and what its behavior means. I know I have raised a lot of questions, and I'm looking forward to hearing from this panel of the all distinguished speakers today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Mr. Peter Demele indeed has raised a number of questions, very perceptive, very important questions, and I'm sure our panelists will address many of those questions as we move along in today's panel discussion. I will now call upon three very distinguished panelists, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, Dr. Andrew Small, and Ms. Suhasini Haidar to speak for about 10-12 minutes each. Thereafter, we'll have open discussion. Please raise your questions in the chat box. You may also indicate your interest in asking a question in the chat box or by raising your hand using the raise hand option. I'll invite you to do so. You may unmute yourself and ask your question or offer your comments as concisely as possible. Let me now begin with our first panelist of the afternoon, Dr. Andrew Small. Andrew is Senior Atlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and he has written extensively on Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China and related subjects. It's indeed a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ambassador Kantha, and very little at all that I disagreed with in your excellent introduction. Thanks also to ICS and to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for the chance to take part in this discussion today. I'm going to try and cover three areas in my kind of opening comments. Essentially, the factors that will condition China's dealings with Afghanistan in the coming period of time, the trajectory of Chinese policy on Afghanistan as a result of that, and depending on where some of these things come out, and a little bit on the strategic dynamics between China and the US as well. But to begin with, I think it is worth reminding, just in terms of how we got here and where Chinese thinking is on this, this has been understood by China as a headache, primarily. They wanted a conditions-based withdrawal from the US. They've been going on for many years about how they didn't want to see an irresponsible US withdrawal. They didn't want to see the Taliban take power in an emboldened fashion. They didn't want to see an outright military victory on the battlefield. They wanted to see the Taliban hemmed in by the need to make political compromises. They think, and they have thought, that in these conditions, this is a situation in which the Taliban are less likely to even have to pretend to moderate or pretend even in the short term to reach compromises. So they have gone into this, both the US withdrawal and the manner in which they're going to have to deal with the Taliban with some concern, and I think this was very, very clear on the Chinese side. Now, this is a long-standing relationship that China have with the Taliban, and kind of go through the history of this. It is a set of ties that they've maintained essentially in various forms in unbroken fashion since the late 1990s. And one can go through Lu Xulin's trip, the dealings with Mullah Omar, the secret meetings that took place in Pakistan after the US withdrawal. This has been a continuous relationship that China has maintained on good terms in various ways since the very early agreements that were reached during the Taliban's last time in government. They provided them with money, they provided them with arms during their time in opposition. But the fact that this is a long-standing relationship also means that China is under very few illusions about what the Taliban are and are not willing to do, and what the kinds of political guarantees that they provide on certain issues actually amount to in practice on the ground. And the main issues that China has in the coming period, and the main issues they are going to really be the decisive ones in terms of the nature of the relationship with Afghanistan, with the Taliban, and China's future policy there are several. First, as discussed, the Taliban's dealings with ETIM, as China continues to call them, and it's TIP of course, but ETIM being the legal designation of the UN. What the Taliban's dealings are with other groups that cause a problem to China, and that's particularly the TTP. The capacity of the Taliban to actually control security in Afghanistan, the capacity to achieve some level of political stability in Afghanistan, and then the ability of the Taliban to hit certain, at least minimal standards of acceptability internationally so that they're not sanctioned as a terrorist state. And to run through each of these, ETIM has been the top issue on the agenda pretty much through the entire period of time that China has been dealing with the Taliban. And pretty much the same guarantees have been provided by the Taliban whenever these interactions have taken place. Territory will not be used for attacks on Chinese soil. and then certain specific conditions in terms of the kind of operating environment for these groups. It's never been about handing people over or generally about expelling them. Even back when the Taliban were last in power, essentially what happened was that any of the Uyghur militants went to join training camps that belonged to, for instance, the IMU and things like that. There've been conditions applied on what they can do. But if you look at what China's expectations actually are when it comes to some of these groups, this is very, very far below the threshold that they expect from most states that they deal with on this. This is still not, as far as China is concerned, an entirely satisfactory outcome. And they've seen in much more kind of pronounced ways the level of kind of hosting, support, joint operations, even on the battlefield and things that have been going on in the last period of time as well. The hope on China's part is that this reflected a set of specific conditions that were essentially battlefield conditions, and that with the Taliban in power, they'll be able to put different kind of squeeze on members of the group. But this is something that they don't have a huge amount of confidence about, I would say. The other group, of course, that matters in particular to China is the TTP, which has targeted Chinese assets and personnel, in particular in Pakistan, for both direct reasons and as a means of putting pressure on the Pakistani government. And this is something that we've seen worsening considerably in literally the last few months. CPEC had been a very well protected set of projects since its inception. It's not anymore. The attack that took place in Dasu in particular is, I think, probably the worst attack that's taken place on Chinese personnel on Pakistani soil, full stop. And there's a huge issue for China, taken up very directly and personally by Xi Jinping. China is able in the end to pull its presence in Afghanistan to a pretty minimal level. They can have an embassy, minimal numbers of economic projects and things. The spillover implications in the wider region, the security risks to Chinese personnel in the wider region are arguably of a considerably greater concern. And so the dealings with the TTP in that regard do actually matter to China. If you were to get to a satisfactory place on the Taliban's dealings with with transnational militant groups China is concerned about, which I think still are to a certain extent preconditions for a certain quality of relationship between the two sides, then you get onto the other questions that relate to security and political stability in Afghanistan. It is evidently the case that over time China would like to have a deeper level of economic involvement in the country, but there would be a set of conditions that would be required for that as well. And really the risks to Chinese projects and workers there are just at a qualitatively different level from what you see in most other states in the region, and that China expects in the next period of time. This is not just a matter of Taliban saying that they will provide security for projects. The really major investments will take a significant period of time before they deliver any real output or economic returns for China. So the Chinese need a framework that will actually stick. This is one of the reasons that they continue to insist on these questions around an inclusive government and things like that. They don't want to see an illusory period of control that then unravels either internally within the Taliban or with other groups in the country. The fear is that however this holds together in the near term, over the medium to long term, which China needs to hold together if these investments are going to make sense, they need something that is going to is something that's going to be politically sustainable. And even with that, I think the concern that China still has in Afghanistan when it comes to the investments is that the kinds of security threats that they face to projects are extremely diverse. Foreign intelligence services, disgruntled locals in a context in which there are lots of weapons flying around, unhappy factions within the Taliban, even in the best case scenario in terms of kind of the political agreements that are reached, the security conditions that are nominally there, the risks that China sees there are very significant. They've gone through this experience before in Logar, where they thought they had everyone squared, everyone paid off, and they were still getting rocket attacks on the mine. I think there is still going to be a judgment that takes place on the Chinese side with respect to security conditions that is that really reserves judgment on this when it comes to larger scale projects. And finally, on the preconditions, it does make life difficult for Chinese companies if there are serious terrorism sanctions in place from the US and elsewhere, and it creates real problems in the neighborhood if Afghanistan is in an economic mess. So they do want Taliban to jump through at least a few kind of acceptability hoops, including on issues that they don't intrinsically care about, except insofar as they affect Chinese security and Afghanistan's political stability. So you can see the kinds of issues that China is putting stress on at the moment, and the reasons for this. I think what we see now and what we're likely to see in the near term is certainly this continued kind of maintaining ties in a good spirit, and all the language that we've seen there, maintaining the interactions, diplomatic and otherwise, putting a certain amount of pressure on the Taliban on this kind of list of, what are effectively demands from the Chinese side that you've seen being spelled out from everyone from Wang Yi to Xi Jinping directly, as was quoted at the SCA summit, which correspond pretty much to that issue list. And then also, as has been suggested, a very close level of coordination with Pakistan in particular in navigating this, Russia to a certain extent on the international diplomatic front, where it's possible to work far more in lockstep with them than was possible during the last time Taliban were in power, given the Russia-Taliban relationship. They're still very reliant on Pakistan for making judgment calls on Taliban and on Afghan politics more generally. This is not China's comfort zone at all. This is not North Korea. This is not Myanmar. This is a much more difficult and unclear picture. China lacks expertise on this. It doesn't necessarily mean that they trust the Pakistani judgment calls on all of these things, but that's what they're left with in terms of who they have to deal with on that. So Pakistan is still going to be very central to how China handles the Afghan political picture. And what they will also do is leave the prospect of a much bigger economic relationship and investment ties and things as a sort of enticement and incentive if the Taliban are willing to deliver on some of the things that China then wants to see. They will be very happy to have large numbers sloshing around about future investment relationships. They'll be very happy to have people talking about China rushing in for lithium and copper and all of these sorts of things. That's helpful in the dynamics with the Taliban. This is clearly what the Taliban want from the Chinese side. But I think as Ambassador Kanta laid out, we will see in the short term things like modest humanitarian aid, potential forms of financial assistance. We know China doesn't do large scale aid. It's just not a practice. They're not going to change that practice suddenly for the sake of the Taliban. So we're not going to get Western style aid coming in from the Chinese side very clearly. And the investment projects that they will be willing to do, I think in a kind of nearer term framework, will just be on a smaller scale. There'll be taster things with the promise and the hope extended of there being much more to come. BRI connectivity, China's going to be very careful about what level of interconnectivity they want from Afghanistan in the wider region. Right now, they're focused on containing border threats in Central Asia. They're not focused on how can you more deeply interconnect a state they see as posing a significant risk of militancy in the wider neighborhood. So I think that's still going to condition the approach to the BRI as well. Very finally, dynamics with the US. There clearly has been this huge propaganda push to suggest to US allies that this proves Washington's unreliability. Taiwan, of course, is a particular focal point for that, but has also, I think it's also clear that there's a concern on the Chinese side that this is essentially the end of the long window of opportunity that there's been since 9/11, that the US is no longer bogged down on continental Asia, on counterinsurgency, and that it can focus now more seriously on the Indo-Pacific, great power competition, and just the bandwidth on this in Washington changes, that the US had previously, whenever it looked as if it was going to kind of transcend these things, events conspire and the US is pulled back in, Washington's attention is pulled back into these things. And the concern now is that the bandwidth is going to be focused essentially on China. And the concern simultaneously is that China does worry about being sucked into this just as the US steps out. There's a lot of analysis on the Chinese side that talks about Afghanistan as a trap, a trap in various different dimensions, not just about military involvement, but certain levels of political, economic, other deep forms of involvement in Afghanistan that China sees as posing a whole series of risks that we can talk about in the discussion. And I think that's understood in some respects to be the biggest risk for China. ETIM, spillover, cross-border directly from China and the Wakhan corridor is obviously incredibly minimal. That border's locked down. They can contain a lot of this, and they can go back into a containment mode on Afghanistan. They're concerned about what they see. They see current developments, I think, as problematic, unfortunate, but to a certain extent manageable, even if they now see a more adverse security environment in their Western periphery as a result. I think they're more concerned about making what they would see as the bigger strategic error of getting too deeply involved. I think they see that as an error that's much harder to correct on their part. They know, nonetheless, they do need to be more involved diplomatically. They will take on a larger role than they have in the past. They know they have the channels. They know they need to nudge things in certain directions now if they want to engender certain outcomes in Afghanistan. But honestly, this is not a responsibility that they really wanted to take on. They would have been happy to step one level down from the level of involvement, even that they're having to put in place at the moment. And so I think on all of this, when you refract back to the kind of fundamentals of Chinese thinking about all of this, this is still understood in the context of how do you contain the threats, how do you contain the risks, and how do you do so at minimal cost, rather than a great opportunity for China to kind of move in and take strategic advantage of this. They'll see what advantage there is to be gained. Of course, there are some advantages that there are to be gained there, but I think that prism that they have in Afghanistan is fundamentally unchanged. And I'll wrap up there.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that brilliant exposition of many very important issues relating to China's position in Afghanistan. Andrew brought out how China has maintained links with Taliban since late 1990s. He also dwelt on Chinese expectations with regard to ETIM and other radical Islamic groupings in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He shared his thoughts on how China will continue to depend on Pakistan to a great extent as far as understanding domestic dynamics of Afghanistan is concerned, how China will be cautious when it comes to expanding its economic footprint in Afghanistan, though at the same time, China recognizes that it will play a more proactive role compared to what has been the case in the past. Andrew also brought out dynamics of US-China relations with regard to Afghanistan. Thank you very much for that presentation. We now move to our next panelist, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay. Gautam is eminently qualified to speak on this topic. In fact, he has been speaking on this topic quite a bit. He has worked over an extended period in Afghanistan. He had opened India's mission in Afghanistan post-Taliban as Sharjah. Later, he went back to Kabul as ambassador. Gautam has been writing extensively on this subject, and we look forward to his views this afternoon. Gautam, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ashok. I think you actually perhaps overstate my qualifications to speak on the subject, particularly with you and Dr. Small and also Suhasini present in this platform. In fact, my interest has been, my connection has been quite episodic from time to time when things break out. But let me also start by, completely agreeing and appreciating your introduction, as well as the points that have just been made by Dr. Small. And in fact, even if I didn't agree with them, I would be tempted to defer to your expertise on the subject. The common point that I find in both your observations as well as Mr. Rimmel's is that China is going to, approach Afghanistan with a great degree of caution. Its primary impulse is going to be try to contain any negative, influences coming out of Afghanistan. It will not want to get bogged down into the quicksand in Afghanistan, and I totally agree with that. But let me just, for the sake of argument, actually present the other point of view, which is the strategic imperatives and perhaps even the temptations linked also with President Xi Jinping's ambitions, larger ambitions. A lot of us take our cues from Chinese experts, whereas in fact the decision maker is somewhere else. So let me just lay out some of those strategic, temptations, I would say, if not imperatives, for China, and then I'll actually come back to more or less the same points that you make, but let me traverse that route. So the first is, that of course, the in some senses the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is a little baffling. If China is its principal strategic rival, why should the United States actually vacate space, cede space in perhaps the weakest underbelly, not only of China, but also a kind of weak underbelly of Russia, and also have a kind of a strategic location vis-a-vis Iran, which is its kind of other regional rival. And so I'd like to start with sort of two propositions that may seem a little overstated, but nevertheless, I think for the sake of argument that I would like to make. The general rationale that has been given for the US withdrawal is that it is, it is over with nation building. It's achieved its objectives. It has other interests and imperatives, and that, if reconciliation, if the Taliban, if a political settlement was not possible, they don't really care if the Taliban actually occupies Afghanistan as they have done. But I would actually go a little further. The Chinese trajectory, the American trajectory in Afghanistan has moved from counterterrorism to counterinsurgency, drawing on lessons from Iraq, to training and equipping the Afghan National Defense Forces. But I think that in this last phase of negotiations, the US-Taliban deal leading up to the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan with the help of Pakistan, I would say that they have actually abetted the Taliban takeover in many ways. And there were hints of this all along. I mean, the kind of whitewashing of Sirajuddin and Anas Haqqani, the kind of space that they gave to Sirajuddin Haqqani in the New York Times, signaled that basically they were comfortable even with the Haqqani network and positioning them in leadership roles. And the reason for that, I would suggest, is that they have actually set the Taliban, along with the many multiple groups that are associated with the Taliban, onto the region, basically to destabilize China. And of course, Russia and Iran as well. So this is one statement. The second assumption that I'm going to make is that, I think we all assume that there is going to be a kind of incremental path with the Taliban coming, that there'll be some degree of stability. But I would suggest that, in fact, if I compare the birth of the Republic and the birth of the Emirate, we have totally contrasting situations. The birth of the Republic took place with the IS attack at the airport. This is a very disturbing thing. There are links between the Haqqani network and the IS, or at least there are known to be links or reported to be links between them. So if it was collusion, it is a matter of concern. But if it was not collusion and it happened behind the backs of the Haqqani network and the Taliban, then too it is a matter of concern. So I think, we have to be prepared for a very multi-cornered and multi-layered situation in Afghanistan in the coming days. On the one hand, you will have, what the Taliban is showing right now is it's showing a continuation of its ultra-conservative beliefs and practices of the past, along with a much higher degree of militancy on its own. And even if it may not have interests beyond Afghanistan itself, it has fought this 20-year war together, not only with the ISI, but also with 20 to 30 other radical groups stretching from Chechnya and Dagestan to Iran and India. So what we are likely to see is internal repression within Afghanistan, because what they have always maintained is that their jihad does not end with the departure of foreign troops. Their jihad actually includes the elimination of all foreign influence in Afghanistan, which means all the liberal values, all the constitutional values, all the republican values that have come in with the Islamic Republic. So this is one level of conflict. The second level of conflict is going to be the undoubted resistance to that. Right now, Afghanistan is in a state of shock. Even then, we are seeing color, demonstrations about the flag, about women's dresses, suppression of protests. We have the resistance in Panjshir, suppressed, but Clearly, there are attempts to regroup. And as Taliban repression continues, we can expect to see, more rallying around of the resistance groups, perhaps in Tajikistan, perhaps in Iran, and there will be other countries that will be supported. There are also ethnic fault lines within the resistance group. Within them there is the kind of North-South division, the North Pashtun, non-Pashtun divisions that could also take shape. And finally, there is the whole, conflict between IS and Taliban and the entire range of groups that are there. Presently, they're all cooperating, but clearly there are significant, rivalries between the IS and the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban as well. And so the scenario that I actually fear and is likely to be the most is not even that the resistance will triumph, but that the kind all the many other potential conflicts that could be there in Afghanistan. So this is the background in which we are talking about China's entry. So at one level, I think China, particularly if I'm thinking in terms of Xi Jinping and also their strategic temptations, I think China will be very tempted by the vacation of US space in Afghanistan to spread its wings, to stretch out its hands in many ways. In the first place, they have a very favorable regional balance of power. Now you have the Taliban in power. At the Taliban, I think the Chinese see them as a stabilizing force, not really a very powerful Islamist force as such, or even a terrorist force. To the extent that they expect that with their relations with Taliban and with Pakistan, they'll somehow be able to manage them. But the overall balance is Taliban, Pakistan, now reinforced by China, and both Russia and Iran not against them. At least for the time being aligned with them, even if in due course they might actually change their spots or their positions for some time. So overall, they see themselves in a very favorable position, as Ambassador Kant also said. Second, there are other reasons for China to use the Afghan space. They have a 400 billion 25-year geo-economic deal with Iran with strategic overtones. I think if we see what they are doing in the Central Asian mountains, my general feeling is that they are positioning themselves to actually puncture the mountains from the Pamirs to the Karakorams, and one could even see their probing moves in the Ladakh mountains in that context. That basically they are positioning themselves to reach out across the Pamirs, the Hindu Kush, the Karakorams, the Himalayas, to link up with Iran, and actually for the first time become a strategic player in the Gulf and the Arab world. And of course, this has to be seen in the context of the larger US-China strategic global rivalry. Secondly, there is another reason to do that. The Chinese realize that they're coming under increasing pressure in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that they actually see the Central Asian mountains as an outlet for the kind of pressures that they anticipate and expect to face in the Indo-Pacific. And I think the AUKUS defense arrangement that has recently been announced will only add to that feeling. Fourth, clearly the kind of relationship that they will have with Pakistan is going to be a relationship in which both piggyback on each other. China will provide the eyes and ears. I think Andrew is absolutely right that this is not an area where China has a comfort level. China has a great difficulty in understanding tribalism. It goes completely counter to their kind of much more rationalistic and instrumental kind of approaches. Even I would say as late as 2012, when their senior Politburo member in charge of security came, it was interesting that the embassy reached out to the Indian embassy for advice on how to conduct a VIP visit, because we had just finished Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's visit and the signing of the strategic partnership agreement, meaning that's how green they were about 8 years back. So clearly they're out of their comfort. They need Pakistan for the political, for the political understanding. But at the same time, they have made their own contacts. They're also known to be in contact with the Haqqani network. So they will rely on Pakistan for the eyes and ears, and Pakistan will rely on China for the strategic heft and the economic muscle. So even when the Americans look at the China-Pakistan collaboration from a kind of intelligence angle and a destabilization angle, there is one part of them that looks at the possibility that perhaps China and Pakistan may actually be able to stabilize the region. I don't know if this is just a lure for the Chinese in their deep strategy, but I think this angle has stepped in. And of course, another very common area between China and Pakistan is that, Pakistan's ultimate ambition in Afghanistan is not only to subjugate it and keep it under its tutelage, but is also to sever its historical and traditional ties with India. And this is, of course, most so, though it is true with all other ethnic groups, it is most so amongst the Pashtuns. And in fact, pivot it or swivel it around towards Central Asia. This has been historic since the time of CENTO and the Economic Cooperation Organization, ECO. Pakistan has been trying to make this relationship, including Afghanistan, towards Istanbul and Turkey and so on. And now, of course, there is an added factor of China. So I think they basically want to turn the relationship of Afghanistan towards that side and sever their relations with India. And what they used to say, using strategic depth in the past, effectively now they are using the language of geoeconomics. Of course, Pakistan is in no position to play geoeconomics, but China is going to be its horse for geoeconomics. Now, having said this, I'd just like to sum up with 2 points. One is, in fact, 2 countries, in my view, have had an interest in destabilization in the Afghanistan and Central Asian region. One, of course, is Pakistan, because Pakistan needs to keep the focus away from the Durand line, from the Pashtun question, from India. And the way it can do that is to somehow submerge Afghan and Pashtun identity into a larger Islamist identity with very blurred territorial boundaries in which all these other groups can also operate. And has an interest in kind of externalizing its problem. So its first phase in this has been the invasion and occupation of Pakistan. But now that it has done that, what is its next move? And my own feeling is that a new chapter is opening where all the groups that were associated with the Taliban in the 1996 to 2021 phase will proceed outwards without necessarily the Taliban doing so themselves. But they will provide the cover and camouflage for it. And Pakistan may well push out, along with the refugees, many of these extremist groups from Pakistani soil and lodge them into Afghanistan, and then make Afghanistan once again, as it was in 1996, a kind of terror central, and pronounce itself as the kind of land of the pure. So I think this is one possibility that if it deals with the ETIM problem by itself, it still has 20, 30 other groups to deal with. And I think China would be very uncomfortable about getting into the role of stabilizing all the other area. So in the end, I come back to the same position that you have, which is to say that it will be cautious. It will basically position itself. Very likely it will make forages towards Iran and the Gulf. At some point of time, it will burn its fingers and it will recoil and step back. But there is a possibility of differences opening up between China and Pakistan on this. Because China ultimately still does want stability, whereas Pakistan has an imperative to keep the region unstable. And in case China is not tempted and brings in its money and is capable of stabilizing the place, then the default option will be, or in fact the default reality will be instability, and differences between China and Pakistan could surface. The other country that I said was interested in destabilization was, of course, the United States, for obviously negative reasons. And the United States is likely to continue to play an intelligence war to keep that region unstable so that China cannot make those moves that we were talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gautam, for that excellent presentation. Gautam, Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay, he brought out some very important factors with regard to internal dynamics in Afghanistan. Against that backdrop, he gave his views on how China is likely to expand, or as he put it, spread its wings in Afghanistan, driven by a number of considerations, not necessarily limited to Afghanistan, but also wider aspirations with regard to Gulf and West Asia, pressure it's under from the USA in Indo-Pacific, and as Gautam put it, the fact that it's rather well placed in terms of regional dynamics in Afghanistan to play a larger role. But Gautam's the scenario he has brought out that China is ambitious, even though it will be cautious, and it's likely to burn its fingers as it spreads its wings in Afghanistan. Let's see how things pan out in Afghanistan. Thank you, Gautam, for that presentation. We now move to our next panelist, Suhasini Haidar, who is diplomatic editor of The Hindu. Suhasini is one of the most respected foreign affairs commentators and analysts of the country, and it's really a pleasure to have her as our panelist this afternoon. Suhasini, would like to make your initial presentation now.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador Kanta, and thank you, of course, to ICS. I should be protesting because after we've heard Professor Small, we've heard Ambassador Mukhopadhyay, there is very little for me to say in terms of the actual understanding of where China is headed in Afghanistan. So I'm going to try and take a slightly broader look at where China is going in general in the region. And because this is the post-lunch session and everybody is close to sleeping, I'm going to start with that bottle of Coke, and I'll explain why. Essentially, when we look at the principles of Chinese investment worldwide, there are maybe 4 parts to what? I mean, obviously, we all understand that China is essentially a country that does not work on principle necessary when it goes out to look at its interests. But if you were to try and psychologically analyze where it has put its money, I think that there are 4 parts to it, and that's why I brought up the Coke bottle, because the first one is really that it is an interest-based investment rather than an ideology-based. It is now beginning to couch it, which I find very interesting, because it means that China is now looking to appeal to a broader audience, if you like, when it couches itself as a democracy, if you like, a democracy with Chinese characteristics, and making a distinction from electoral democracy. I know most of you are now saying, well, tell us why that Coke bottle, but most of you would have heard on August 20th, in one of the first reactions to the events of Afghanistan, the Chinese MFA spokesperson Hua Chunying came out, and this is what she said. Facts show that democracy, I mean, it was a very interesting briefing. I'm sure most of you have seen it already online, but it's worth going through line by line, because there was a lot of glee, there was a lot of Chinese glee, if you like, about the US pulling out. And here's what she said. Facts show that democracy cannot be predetermined or overstretched. There is no set model for democracy. To give you an analogy, Ms. Hua went on, cold milk on a daily basis doesn't agree with a Chinese stomach. Chopsticks aren't often used by Americans. A meal of hamburger or steak is not the only way to get one well fed. Then she goes on to say, democracy is not Coca-Cola, which with the syrup produced by the United States, the secret ingredient tastes the same across the world. Going on to say many Chinese, in fact, prefer the drink called Arctic Ocean. So the first point is that China makes it clear that it doesn't see its interests just in terms of, electoral democracies, as it puts it. The second is that connectivity is very much the front and center of Chinese foreign policy. We saw that announcement in 2013, within 4 years, China bringing the BRI into its constitution. It is very clearly connectivity and the Belt and Road Initiative, as much as it can push the BRI, otherwise just simply connectivity is front and center. The third, that cooperation from the government or the regime in power is very, very important. because it doesn't matter who that government is, it doesn't matter who that regime is, or what nature it takes, but cooperation is very important simply because, and we've seen it in our region, in the Maldives or in Sri Lanka, China needs to get its into that country. And the fourth is really how much that regime has control of its own country, regardless of how it enforces that control. Some very brutal regimes, some very authoritarian regimes, but regardless of how it enforces that control, so long as it can provide stability, there is a Chinese interest in dealing with those who are in control and best placed to provide stability. So what is that bigger picture? And let me see if I can pull up another map for you over here. The fact is that in the last few years, and Andrew referred to it, and so did Ambassador Mukhopadhyay when he spoke about piercing through the mountains, if you like. But here is a sort of recent map of the Belt and Road Initiative as it is seen in the region, and some of it you're already seeing when it goes to Central Asia. The truth is that there are now 6 various economic corridors, but across Central Asia, if you were to look at some of the investment trackers and how much they have found China putting into even just these 4 countries, because Turkmenistan often is very hard to really get the truth on. But if you just were to look at the 4 countries, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Chinese companies have invested, according to these trackers, about $50 billion between 2005 and 2021. The truth is that that these are being put in various, of course, Kazakhstan has perhaps the lion's share of that kind of investment. But when you look at the BRI in general, and you say the BRI has supposedly dispersed between 2013 and 2020 about 755 billion, or promised that much amount, so much of it is actually being taken up by things that go through Central Asia as well. The second part to China's network in the region is, of course, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and there's Andrew's book about it as well. And when you look in terms of the investment, Central Asia, if you look at just those 4 countries, is not far behind Pakistan's investment, which is seen as the major part, the biggest part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which was the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, where there is about $60 billion that China has promised. Not all of it, of course, dispersed, or not most of it yet. Then there is the third, which is the Trans-Afghan Railroad that goes from Termez at the Uzbek-Afghan border. It goes to Mazar. It's supposed to go to Kabul, and then it's supposed to carry on to Peshawar. And the fourth part is the INSTC, the International North-South Transport Corridor, that comes through Bandar Abbas, and then you can take the maritime route into the Indian Ocean. These are all very, very important parts of the Belt and Road Initiative. Fifth, and Gautam referred to it, which is the China-Iran 25-year, $400 billion partnership, which is in infrastructure and oil. We're already seeing, as India, we're already seeing what it actually means, because there are certain Iranian projects that have been lagging because India has been adhering to US's sanctions, its unilateral sanctions on Iran, whereas China has not. And you can almost see those being prized away, for the moment being given to Iranian companies, but there's no question that the funding is expected to come from China. Sixth, there are the oil pipelines. So Russia, which is not a part of the Belt and Road Initiative as such, has this this pipeline project that goes across, again, for a period of 25 years. There is the TAPI. It hasn't made much progress, but when it does, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and possibly India pipeline essentially comes from Galkanish fields, the largest reserves of their kind, with the caveat, because Turkmenistan doesn't allow you to actually buy projects in the way the other BRI countries do, that there is a Chinese loan that actually facilitated the beginning of that. Why am I making such a big deal about this? Because for Central Asia, which is landlocked, a country like Uzbekistan, which is double landlocked, this is a kind of key. Afghanistan is the key to its problems. If you followed some of the conversation at the Tashkent summit at the end of July, where the Uzbek president invited, so many countries there, they signed the Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan transit trade agreement. There was the announcement even of the Americans getting involved with the US, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, a sort of transit trade agreement. The idea behind all of these is essentially very simple. The answer is that when you are landlocked, as Central Asia is, they have several routes to the ocean, but the quickest route to the quickest ocean, the closest ocean, is essentially to the Indian Ocean, and it does perforce have to go through Afghanistan. If you want to deal with Afghanistan, even when the Taliban was not in power or not claimed power the way it has in Kabul, the Taliban had a violence veto and therefore had to be engaged. And Uzbekistan was amongst the first countries to actually invite a Taliban delegation to Tashkent. If you do want that Taliban veto to be managed or controlled, there is no question that Pakistan needs to be on board. So while you might have the notional option of going from Afghanistan to Chabahar and into into Iran, and then instead of going through Karachi and Gwadar, you're essentially saying that if you want control of the Taliban or you want to manage that problem, that has to be done with Pakistan. If you want to deal with Pakistan, the truth is that every country feels more comfortable dealing with Pakistan if they already have a handle with China. So this has become a part of a much larger network than people realize. And these 6 pipelines and infrastructure, roadways and cargo lines are just a small part of that big plan for the region. The second part of China's interest in Afghanistan is natural resources, and many have mentioned that China has not really made good after that, the consortium leased the mesaite mines for, I think, 30 years in 2008. But the fact is that the natural resources of Afghanistan are the stuff of legend: 60 tons of copper reserves, more than 2 billion tons of iron ore, 1.4 million tons of rare earth minerals, which is going to be one of the things for the future, particularly lithium needed for electric vehicle batteries. It's a virtual cornucopia for anyone who was able to provide stability and actually mine these mineral resources. The interesting thing is that there are also, according to some geological surveys, things like oil and natural gas possibilities as well. Those have not yet been tapped, but China is, with a very small investment, already showing a kind of first bags advantage or first movers advantage on those. The third reason for China's interest is that this is the key to stability in the region in many ways. If you were to look at the violence in Afghanistan, this poses perhaps the biggest threat to the entire region. There is no part of this region, including India, that technically doesn't have a manned boundary with Afghanistan that is not going to be affected if a linchpin was to be taken out in Afghanistan and that grenade was to burst. It will affect all these countries around, including China. There are terror groups within of all shape or form, according to the latest UN reports also. All of them continue to exist in Afghanistan, from Al-Qaeda to ISIS, from Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed and all the rest of that. The second is, of course, the worry about those transnational groups that are threatening countries without. China is, of course, one of them when it talks about the ETIM, and we'll come to Xinjiang in just a second. And Uzbek groups as well. Uzbek and other Central Asian countries are worried about groups that try to radicalize in their region as well. And the third, of course, for China is the worry about the radicalization in Xinjiang. Xinjiang is often seen for the world, and we all look at it with some horror of the kind of stories and the reports that come out of there of concentration camps, of the kind of oppression of people, the repression of religion in Xinjiang. But little notice is paid to the fact that what Xinjiang represents for China. This is not just or undeveloped part of the country that China wants to bring development to by doing all of these very, very ruthless methods of standardization and sinicization, as it is called. It is the window to the BRI if you were to look at the continental route. And let's remember, more and more people are talking about the economic viability of things like running the China-Europe cargo railway line. If you're talking about pushing more goods across the land lines, across, from Yiwu all the way to the UK or to Italy and Greece, this is going to be the window, or it could become the bottleneck for China when it comes to its grand plan for the Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm talking not years in the future, but possibly for decades in the future. Thirdly, in terms of security, and I don't need to tell the August gathering here, China has an inordinate fear, completely out of context or in comparison to the actual violence on the ground in Xinjiang. China's worry about Uyghur groups and about the security situation in Xinjiang is certainly much more than anyone expects. So again, Afghanistan, which has that Wakhan corridor, which has Badakhshan right there, is going to be something China will look at much more closely than people might think it merits. And finally, when China looks at Afghanistan, it looks at a complete and strategic control of South Asia in a certain sense. Why do I say that? To begin with, there is the India-China relationship, the tensions of the last year, but also much, much more. The idea that when India carried out its August 5th moves on Jammu and Kashmir, that the Home Minister spoke about the idea of taking back POK and taking back Aksai Chin, is something that in future calculations for China is very important to try and counter. Not just because of course, the loss of land and territory, but because this is the route for China through the Karakoram Highway to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. This is a route that abuts Xinjiang, which, as I have said, there is an inordinate fear about the security situation over there. So there is the desire to somehow contain and manage not just the threat coming from Afghanistan, but the threat coming from India as well. We've already seen a different kind of South Asian positioning by China in the last 2 years of COVID, far from being seen as the villain or where this virus has come from. In South Asia, we have seen China giving vaccines. For the first time, Bhutan has accepted vaccines from China because India was unable to, after the second wave, provide them. We have seen China set up groups that virtually involve, and Peter makes the point that SARC, not having the SARC meeting in New York is a mistake, but China is practically doing a SARC minus India, if you like, by involving all the other countries in some shape or form, holding these multilateral meetings that we are seeing on poverty alleviation. They've already got a poverty alleviation center that brings in everyone but India, Bhutan, and the Maldives. And then, as I said, there are the vaccines. So if you were to look in that larger framework as well, whether it is South Asia, whether it is Central Asia, Afghanistan is really at the center of both of them. And any strategic thinker in China is looking at it in that larger context as well as what they see in Afghanistan itself. Now, there are many ways to view China's future in Afghanistan. Of course, there's the glee at the US retreat, but that isn't a zero-sum game. Let's remember very clearly that when the talks began with the Taliban, they were actually spearheaded not by China. China has taken a big role in the last 2 months, but these are essentially US-initiated talks. If there was a grouping multilaterally that was effective when it came to talking to the Taliban, it was the US, Russia, China troika that met 6 times in the last 2 years without most people knowing, and then the troika plus that brought in Pakistan to discuss how to go about this. So there is a sense that now China has been handed the baby, if you like, but and then it is going to have to deal with whatever happens in Afghanistan. The second part is going to be the question people have already raised: how much is China really going to invest in Afghanistan? It put $30 million down at the Geneva conference right now. And if it does try to sink more investment in, it might find it is losing much more. The third is that China's relationship with Pakistan has become such a double clinch now that China is now responsible for whatever Pakistan does. And the loss of the Taliban, of the kind Gautam mentioned, where the Taliban's inter-Nassim rivalries are playing out, will also eventually reflect on China. And finally, the worry about Xinjiang and the Wakhan corridor, Badakhshan, is not completely unlikely. It could once again see a revival when it comes to extremism and radicalization. But I do over here now agree with each of the previous speakers when they have said China has not approached it without some amount of caution. The first part, as I said, was that it has not been a unilateral approach to the Taliban. It has been a kind of step-by-step, helped along by this US, Russia, China troika that kept meeting even through COVID and everything else. China certainly kept its embassy in Kabul, but we haven't yet heard its conversation about recognition. And remember, there's a small flare going up just now when you see that China has agreed with the United Nations not to provide recognition if for the Myanmar junta's representative at the UN. If that is the case, and we'll only know in October, then it's a question about whether China is actually going to go ahead and help with recognition for the Taliban as Pakistan continues to push for it. It's kept, as I said, its assistance modest so far. It took that 30-year lease when it came to investment in the copper project in Afghanistan, but 13 years later, it's 13 years now, no work has actually started there. There is a sense that while in other places, the South China Sea, whether it comes to the line of actual control with India, we have seen a certain amount of unilateralism. It has been described as hegemonic moves by China. In Afghanistan, however, we are actually seeing that come with a lot of caution. So I'm going to stop over there. I know I've gone a little over, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Thank you, Suhasini. You really covered so much ground, provided your perspectives on a wide range of issues. I will not even try to sum up what you said, but a number of questions have come up, and we will I'm sure we'll discuss those issues here. As we wait for questions, the chat box, may I exercise my privilege as the chair and raise some questions for response from the panelists. Let me begin with Dr. Andrew Small. Andrew, we discussed how China is talking about a more inclusive, a more broad-based dispensation emerging in Kabul. How serious China is about a more inclusive government in Afghanistan, and how does it link up that issue with the issue of recognition that Suhasini talked about? How do you think the question of recognition of the Taliban-led regime, which is at present Taliban regime in Kabul, will play out in months to come?
Thanks for that. It's a very difficult question, actually, because there's how much does China intrinsically care about this, and there's how much does it matter for kind of wider purposes. I mean, again, going back to this question of, does this matter in terms of the fact that if the Taliban don't do this, this will mean that they're unable to achieve diplomatic recognition and some of these sorts of things. How far is China invested in this as a matter of the form, the constellation of power that they actually want to see emerge in Afghanistan, and therefore what are they willing to do about it in the end as well? And I think the problem, I mean, actually, even in your introductory comments, talking about the kind of what we've seen about Taliban 2.0 and more rational and things like that. This is obviously from their interactions with certain factions in the Taliban. This is the what we've seen with the situation with Mullah Baradar and things like that. I mean, this is a matter of concern. I mean, even the level of visibility that they were prepared to give to Mullah Baradar as well with the July meeting. I mean, from some on the Chinese side, this is partly also about his role within the Taliban in terms of kind of relative degrees of moderation, relative openness to the sorts of things that China was looking at. I mean, of course, it reflected his formal role as well. But when we're talking about the kind of the forces within the Taliban, of course, that China wants to see succeed, that there are answers to that question as well. So what they're doing at the moment is clearly they have held back, and they've tried to operate in lockstep with Pakistan and Russia in particular in withholding certain things until they see certain outcomes. And the fact that Xi Jinping again personally stressed this, I mean, go through the lists of statements from Chinese officials and leaders and what the relative emphasis that they're placing on these things. Xi Jinping personally mentioning this in the way that he did in the SCO speech means that this is still being pressed on the Chinese side, and they can see that some degree of kind of holding back on diplomatic recognition and ensuring that others hold back as well is kind of an essential part of the process of putting some degree of pressure on that. Now, on the assumption that we don't get to an outcome on that, will China continue simply to deal pragmatically with them? Of course, are the circumstances in which you end up moving towards a form of recognition anyway in certain situations. Also, if there are pragmatic reasons to do that, they'll do that. But they do see a window at the moment in which this is critical for the Taliban, particularly in terms of access to funds and finance, as well as their interest in international legitimacy, to actually put a certain degree of pressure directly through the way they're handling it, and to a certain extent, through the other channels that they have. And going back to some of the other comments, these do come back to questions around a certain degree of tension with Pakistan on this as well. The two sides have not been completely joined up on this question. They are dependent on Pakistan to handle some of these things, but they know that the balance of judgments in terms of how this comes out, which also goes to questions of which factions within the Taliban they actually would prefer to see in the ascendancy, and which the Pakistanis would like to see. There have always been little disputes about that, even going back to the first times that Mullah Baradar was trying to meet with the Chinese. And so these tensions and these issues, they would like Pakistan in the end to kind of handle this, but they know that, this is a policy Pakistan has pursued, that China's always had hesitation and trepidation about. They've given the space. There's degrees to which they won't push back on this. They've always been ambivalent about whether this is actually something the Pakistanis have a handle on, and is going to turn into something that rebounds in ways that are damaging to China in a way that they've kind of seen at different junctures in the 2000s on various other fronts. So I think this is a good example as well of one of the kind of slight notes where, yes, they will be extremely closely coordinated. They will not be visibly out of step with each other on this, but there will be points of tension on some of those questions as well privately.
Thank you. Let me now turn to Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay. Gautam, Suhasini talked about 6 connectivity projects. You also talked about China's aspirations with regard to Gulf and West Asia, desire to punch a hole through the Karakorams, Pamirs, Hindu Kush and Himalayas. Against this backdrop, how do you see China's BRI project shaping up in Afghanistan?
Thank you, Ashok. In many ways, they don't really need to offer any BRI projects in Afghanistan, because as Suhasini brought out, there are several connectivities through Central Asia directly through Iran, except for that little problem of Turkmenistan. But this other issue, this Central Asian Quad that the Americans talked about, and this connectivity from Mazar, Uzbekistan, directly to the Arabian Sea, that is something I think that is very much on the minds of both the Central Asian countries, just as it was for the Russians long back. When they were seeking their warm water ports. Here it's not warm water ports, but it's just access to the sea. So I think this remains very much there. And actually the missing links on that is not very much. it is really only expanding the corridor that already exists. I mean, the corridor from Mazar to Kabul exists, from Kabul to Peshawar exists, and from Peshawar to Gwadar exists. But it's just a question of operationalizing it and expanding it. But I think it is more in terms of the kind of temptations the temptation that the Taliban would have in terms of projects and in terms of money and in terms of solidifying their rule. And it links up actually to your previous question to Andrew, because I actually think the Taliban don't really care much about legitimacy. The kind of government that they have formed right now, it shows that they could cock a snook even at China. Because if China wants a kind of moderate, open, inclusive government, what Pakistan and the Taliban have actually shown is practically a hostile takeover of the Taliban by the Haqqani network, which, by the way, was not part of the Taliban before. It predated the Taliban and existed as a separate network entirely. But over the last 3-4 years, before the final thrust for the takeover of Afghanistan, effectively Taliban has come out on top. And in the cabinet formation that we have seen also, the Taliban has come out on top. And the only thing that the Taliban actually need from the international community is precisely what they're going to China for, which is some form of investment and economic assistance. So, the BRI will form that kind of possibility for the Taliban to get this kind of international investment and international, economic assistance. And the Chinese are quite capable of, particularly in connection with their economic investments, looking for investments in connectivity that would double up as a kind of strategic connectivity as well as an economic connectivity for their investments.
Thank you, Gautam. Let me now turn to Suhasini. Suhasini, Gautam outlined this rather provocative scenario of China getting sucked into Afghanistan and Afghanistan turning out to be its soft underbelly. What are your comments on that?
Well, I mean, to begin with, history is certainly on the side of, this empire of graveyards theory. There are enough people who are predicting that China, like others, will be first seduced by the possibilities of Afghanistan and then will be sucked into this sinkhole, as you pointed out. And the real question will be, will at some point Chinese boots go on the ground in Afghanistan in order to protect itself? Because unlike the United States and Russia and the UK, the previous empires that were found in the dust later, China actually has a boundary. My own sense is that Xinjiang is going to be a kind of, it'll be the most important part of all of this, of how China wants to approach its interest in Afghanistan. If it sees the possibility of perhaps being able to benefit its goals and its agenda in Xinjiang, I think it might go ahead with that. But I have not seen signs that China is going to do anything only by hubris, or is going to be guided over here to do things only on its own. As I pointed out, we may see actions at the LAC or actions in the South China Sea, or possible actions in the future in Taiwan, as essentially Chinese unilateral projects. Afghanistan has not been a unilateral project for China. It has been the kind of more silent partner with Russia for much of this negotiation. It has been very involved in the infrastructure because of the Pakistan possibilities. And, there's no question. I mean, it's not just China. The fact that the US announced this US-Uzbekistan-Afghanistan pipeline, Pakistan corridor, and then went ahead, I don't think it's very well known, but between May and July this year, the US itself paid for and conducted convoys on a trial run from Tashkent to Karachi, through Peshawar and through Afghanistan. It took 8 days for one of the cargo runs to go. Then they tried one from Bishkek to Tashkent and then down to Karachi, to Gwadar or to Karachi port. So it's not just China that would be excited about the ideas of and the possibilities that a stable Afghanistan could provide for it. But I do think that it's a consistent position or a consistent approach to dealing with Afghanistan has not been unilateral. Even when it decided to keep its embassy, it was one of 6 countries. Eventually, Turkey joined as well. So China, Pakistan, Russia, Qatar, Turkey, and Iran all have embassies in Afghanistan. And we haven't seen them come out after the formation of the government in quite the same way. I mean, even Saudi Arabia was perhaps more effusive about the new government over there. So I'm not convinced that China is going to take this leap as many are predicting, and some are even hoping it will take and get bogged down in Afghanistan in a way that it cannot extricate itself very quickly from.
Thank you, Suhasini. Well, we are running out of time, but very quickly we'll take some questions from the floor. We have Mr. Devendra Kumar posing a question in the chat box, which is essentially on what kind of role SEO can play in Afghanistan. Andrew, would you like to take that question?
I mean, briefly on this, we are evidently seeing now a higher level of regionalization of the issue. China will, in particular, always, if we're talking about this through a Chinese kind of prism, will want to do this with something that looks like a bit of multilateral or at least plurilateral cover for anything that's going on. There's a lot of what of what China will itself do on this that will be refracted through other groupings and other entities. I mean, one can debate the kind of relative capacity of the SCO itself to do anything particularly meaningful, but the clusters of countries that can work through it and then try to badge some of these things as being SCO initiatives and things. And this is evidently something that China is kind of placing greater stress on with the SCO. They don't want to be seen to be operating too directly themselves if they can help it. I think that's going to continue to be kind of a trait in how they approach this. If you talk to the Chinese, even who are involved in some of the thinking on questions about longer term investments and things like that, the shift over the last few years in general from a, we could step in on a more expansive scale to anything that we do has to be kind of carefully couched through kind of multilateral, plurilateral processes. They know that the Belt and Road is much more contested now. They know there is opposition from various places. They want some additional cover. The SCO provides one form of cover for them on some of this. And so I think they'll use it as a channel. I think there's an entirely separate question about whether beyond the kind of clusters of countries that are involved in the substance of these issues, it's meaningful to talk about it as the SCO and what the SCO is doing, or whether it's in essence kind of small subgroupings that are driving this agenda.
Thank you. I'll now invite General Prabir Chakravarti to ask his question. Since we are really short of time, can you keep the question very short?
Yes, so it'll be very short. So the question is I'll put it to Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhyay. China, wherever she has gone, she has had a base, whether it's, say Sri Lanka, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Myanmar. Do you see the Bagram base being occupied by the PLA or by some civilian agency, since it makes no difference in China who occupies it? Because there's no exit otherwise from Afghanistan in the present scenario.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Gautam, we'll take two more questions.
Sure.
Panelists to respond.
Yeah.
We will have questions from Ashok, Alex, Luke, and Alok Singh. Ashok would like to ask you a question first. And keep it short.
Yes. My question is to Srimati Suhasini Haidar. Why the United States is still funding Pakistan when it knows that Pakistan is diverting its funds to the Taliban?
Okay, now Alok Singh. Alok, please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. Okay, I think Alok seems to have problem. So, Gautam, will you respond to General Chakravarti's question and then Suhasini?
Yeah, thank you, General Chakravarti. I think basically I would agree and go along with Suhasini when she says that I think China is not inclined to, towards an expeditionary kind of involvement in Afghanistan. In fact, I don't think that's generally been its strategy at all. And it would work, through various kinds of plurilateral arrangements, not entirely alone, perhaps a lot of it through Pakistan, but also hedge its bets. So the chances of it kind of taking over Bagram are really very low. I think that's all that I would say at this point of time. I think there's, that caution metaphor is there. My general point in this on China is that China will use this opportunity to position itself for the long game, but it may not necessarily do anything rash that is likely to hurt it in the long run.
Thank you. Suhasini?
And just to add to that, if it were to take over Bagram, it would be because it was being cautionary. In fact, many have now questioned, even within the United States, why the US chose to leave Bagram to begin with after it had built such formidable infrastructure in there, and why it chose to leave Bagram before the rest of its army had left and before its citizens had been pulled out. Because had they been in Bagram rather than the Hamid Karzai International Airport, they would have been much more secure and would have been much easier to pull out. To the question that from Ashok about why the US persists, the US's funding of Pakistan has reduced considerably in the last few years. And as far as the FTF is concerned, what it used to give in terms of its 2001 commitments to Pakistan, they are almost down to zero, and they are in arrears, in fact. Over there. The larger question is the US really interested in curbing the Taliban or punishing Pakistan for having helped the Taliban into power? Because I do ask the question that if it was the US that was trying to hold the Taliban back from power, then why did the US sign an agreement with the Taliban? Why not just leave Afghanistan to its fate and not sign an agreement with the Taliban that essentially said, so long as you do not target American soldiers, i.e. you can target the Afghan ANDSF, so long as you don't target US and our allies, we are actually prepared to leave Afghanistan, more or less making it almost the Taliban was the default force to go in there. If 20 years ago, the US put 135 Taliban leaders on their list of people who were UN designated terrorists, then why is it that when 20 years later, it becomes very evident that not only are these terrorists still floating around, they actually have had safe havens in Pakistan for all this period. The response of the US was not to say, let's put UN sanctions against Pakistan for having harbored all of them. The US response is, can we please help Pakistan so that we can actually help, that Pakistan can help us engage with the Taliban. Pakistan has been, in fact, promoted at every stage and helped out simply because it is able to deal with the Taliban. It's a kind of hoarse whisperer for the Taliban, if you like. So I am not very convinced that the United States had decided by the end that it really wanted to stop the Taliban from coming to power. My final point over there is what happened to the over-the-horizon attacks, because there was one statement from the US that said that if the Taliban chose to take over cities in Afghanistan, that there would be an airstrike on those cities. And while it is now explained as saying that the Taliban took over those cities without violence, if you now see the Washington Post coverage of the last conversation President Biden held with President Ghani, Mr. Ghani actually refers 3 times to the US's promise of air support and saying, if you send us the air support, it will make a big difference. The reason I'm pointing that out is by not doing those strikes, the US more or less sent the message out that it was not going to stop the Taliban's ascension to power in Kabul, and effectively hastened the process. And Bagram is as well an indicator of this. Hastened the process where we saw the ANDSF not just be defeated, they didn't actually go out to fight in most places, they simply sublimated or disappeared. So I think those are the big questions. the US funding of Pakistan would possibly be the least of it.
Thank you, Suhasini. Well, we have absolutely run out of time, so I'll have to bring this panel discussion to a close now. Let me thank Mr. Peter Emele for his introductory remarks, which in a way set the ball rolling with a number of very thought-provoking questions with regard to China's position in Afghanistan. And then we had 3 excellent presentations by Andrew Small, Gautam Mukhopadhyay, and Suhasini Haidar, and good, very rich and enlightening Q&A session followed. So thank you very much, Peter. Thanks to all the panelists, and thanks to all of you for an excellent panel discussion we had this afternoon. Thank you.